getting much more into talks and things, I'm going to start off introducing our first keynote speaker. Well, let me start off introducing Mr. Raghu Das. Mr. Raghu Das is the CEO of IDTECHex of Cambridge, UK. This is a company that sort of tracks emerging technologies, and he's been doing it, I understand, for 17 years. And so a lot of emerging technologies that you had tracked is most probably now ancient and technology. But he's been tracking that, and he's been going all over the world, talking in seminars, and I believe he's already spoken to 500 plus sort of these seminars. So, and he's also been cited by periodicals like the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times as one of the leading experts in this area. So there's a lot of interesting and new technology ideas that I think we hope to hear from Raghu. So talking about innovation is the future. Ladies and gentlemen, our first keynote speaker, Mr. Raghu Das.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me here. It's also my first time in Bangladesh, and yesterday I had the chance to tour a little bit of the city, and it's great to see the historic parts. So it's a real honor for me to be here. Thank you for your time. And what I'll be presenting on is really the disruption and innovation we're seeing through emerging technologies. I'm going to focus on emerging technologies because that's what my company does. We help companies to really understand how different innovations and emerging technologies is allowing them to differentiate and fix big problems in the world. So I'll be looking at a range of different technologies and how companies, large and small, around the whole world are beginning to use these to differentiate. So I think innovation is always comes from a need, and the question is, why do you do what you do, and why is there a need to innovate? And people innovate because they're facing some problem, or there's huge issues which will come about which need to be resolved. For example, if we look at some of the major megatrends going forward, we have things like the aging population. 2/3 of the people in the history of mankind who have ever reached the age of 65 are still alive today. And that situation is getting worse as the population grows. There's not enough young people to look after the elderly. So we need new technologies to help people get access to medication, and even without doctors, help people understand what they need to be taking and when. There's also a huge change in things like mobility, where, yesterday I had the chance to go through the streets here in Dhaka, and I was told the traffic was very good for a Friday. It was the day off. So I'd like to see what it's like today or tomorrow, because it was pretty bad yesterday. So here we're seeing technologies like even drones come in and others, which can help countries leapfrog what other aspects are doing and really get to address some of those issues. But another strong need for innovation is product differentiation. And a lot of the companies that we deal with are in a status where they may have seen very strong growth over a few years, but now that growth is slowing down, and so they're looking to do something different from the competition and invest heavily through innovation. But innovation doesn't come just through technologies, it's also completely new business models. And here are a few examples of significant digital disruption that we have seen just over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's really escalating now and moving ahead very quickly. For example, the biggest hotel company in the world by value doesn't own a single hotel. It's Airbnb. And similarly, if you look at organizations like Uber, the largest taxi firm, again, in the world, doesn't own a single regular vehicle. And in a very short period of time, they've come in and completely disrupted this space. And the question, I think, for you is, what is the Uber and the Airbnb and the Netflix of your industry? Because if you're not thinking about that, your competitors certainly are. And so there's a lot of innovation coming in just through new business models and digital disruption, which means that you don't have to own any real estate. You don't need necessarily lots of investment to put out a taxi fleet. You can leapfrog what some of the competition is doing. So what we do at IDTECHex is really help companies by addressing what are their opportunities by looking at a range of emerging technologies. And what I'm going to be doing now is going through a range of technology innovations And more critically, look at why companies are using these technologies to innovate. So what is the driving force behind these innovations going forward? Let's start off with structural electronics, a fairly new area that we're seeing in this world of technology innovation. Over the last 100 years, electronics has been very similar. For the first 50 years, in between 1900 to 1950, it was mainly bulky components put together with some form of wiring. And then 50 years later, we saw the introduction of things like miniaturization, printed circuit boards, allowing us to do much more in a smaller area. And that innovation meant that we now have laptops, we have smartphones, because we can condense a lot of functionality into a fairly small unit area overall, allowing us to do more things. But that's the old. There's much more coming forward in the world of structural electronics, where we're moving away from this approach of components in a box, so having discrete components which are in bulky boxes and encapsulated and they're brittle, to moving to structural electronics, where the structure of things becomes functional. So this can include, for example, as shown on the bottom left here, printing antennas or functional materials onto a surface. But it can also include having components which can be load-bearing as well. So take, for example, work being done by Volvo. In this example, they're taking some of the weight out of a boot lid and they're replacing that material with a functional component, an energy storage device, in this scenario, a supercapacitor. So now the component is partly load-bearing. So the boot lid acts as both an electrical component, but it's also part of the overall structure, taking some of the impact. So here we have a great example of structural electronics, and the benefit is lightweighting, so it helps car companies meet new emissions set by governments. It also creates more space in the vehicle, and so on. So these are just some of the innovations we're seeing going through, and the main driver being aspects like customization, lightweighting, but also the ability to save space and move electronics away from being a 2D technology to a truly 3D technology like the world we live in. An example of how structural electronics is being used today are companies who are taking printing, moving away from inkjet printing on 2D surfaces like we all do at home, to inkjet printing on 3D surfaces, such as here, printing on antennas onto the casing of mobile phones. The benefit here is that by creating a 3D antenna, you can rapidly customize them. Every single one can be made different because they're all printed. I think one of the industries very relevant here in Bangladesh is the wearable and textile sector. So this is the market for wearable technology around the world. Of course, we've had things like headphones and smartwatches for some time. There's a lot of growth going forward in this, and I think there's an opportunity here for many companies in the textile sector to start thinking about electronics and how they can add greater value. So rather than just doing a commodity product and racing to the bottom of the cost curve, innovate to fix certain needs to really help enable, create new markets and also premium price your product. So we look at the medical and healthcare side. Many of us, when we've had illnesses, we have them over a period of time, but we go into the doctor, and within that 2 or 3 minute window you have in front of the doctor, you may not be able to reveal, or you may not have the symptoms that you've been having over an extended period of time. So in this case, we're seeing a lot of companies who are working on electronic textiles, for example, which can monitor your health over a period of time. So now you have the data to show to your doctor so they can understand really what's wrong with you and help you best address that. Indeed, you don't necessarily even then need to see the doctor because that data can be uploaded. So for people who don't have easy access to doctors or healthcare, it doesn't matter. We can have this sort of virtual world. So there's a lot going on in wearables, moving it away from the old types of wearable technology from smartphones, which are still electronics, which are rigid and don't conform to you, to move to devices like e-textiles, which for the first time are electronics which do conform to your body. So a lot of that innovation has come through the development of new materials and through new components, as shown here. We have, for example, just 2 years ago, only 1 or 2 ink companies around the world who developed inks which can be stretchable but also conductive, so they can be used as sensors, for example, in wearables. But now we have about 30 ink suppliers around the world. And they're all looking for new avenues for their functional links, and that's one of the reasons why they're innovating. And it's really helping us to enable this new world of electronic textiles, which can tell you more about yourself. So just in a few years, it's already created a business of about $150 million, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. And a lot of that is going into premium sportswear and business, allowing athletes to monitor where they are. And these are devices which are expensive, and so therefore they're premium price, and they're being sold in niche markets at the moment to professionals, but later on moving more into the medical and healthcare space. If we look at the e-textile value chain, I think it's interesting to see where we currently are, because it's at a very early point, and still there's lots of opportunities still for textile companies to get in. And it's really the coming together of two main industries, the traditional textile industry, but also the electronics industry. And so I think part of innovation is having two different sectors, in some cases, come together, or working with disciplines outside of the disciplines that you're normally used to working with. In some cases, we have electronics companies trying to learn about textiles or hiring that in-house, or vice versa with textile companies. But some of the biggest and most serious investments we've seen are joint ventures between companies. So we look at Mass Holdings, who are, I believe, a Sri Lankan-based company, one of the larger textile-based companies, and they have recently announced a joint venture with Flex. Flex are an electronic manufacturing services company. They make laptops and they make smartphones for brands like Apple and Samsung and so on. And so together, these two are coming together to create a whole new world of wearables which are smart, which have electronic functionality. In other cases, we're seeing many textile companies do their own work, but also link up with electronics companies. So I think it's an exciting area, still very embryonic going forward, and an area perhaps where companies here can add some value and see some innovation. Because these companies are looking to do more than provide, a product which is just a bit lower cost than the competition, but provide something that people are willing to pay 10 times more money for because it provides some unique functionality. Then there's the Internet of Things, connecting things, and Industry 4.0, which you've already heard a little bit about. And this is the combination of many different types of technologies. It's more than just having wireless sensors on items to monitor how they're performing. It also moves into things like digital manufacturing. One of the companies that we work with in the US, but they do global manufacturing, they make shoes around the world. And it used to be they would make different designs and molds of shoes in one central location, and then ship these to different locations around the world where these molds and templates were then used to create the shoes. Now what they do is that in their software program, they create that master image of the new shoe they'd like to make. And using 3D printing, they email that image file to their sites all around the world, and the 3D printers there print out that mold, and so now they can start manufacturing these shoes much more quickly. So I think it's a really good example of digital manufacturing, where it used to take 2 or 3 days to ship these out to different sites. Now it takes about 2 hours to print this mold, so they have some slight competitive advantage over their competitors by being able to manufacture these a little bit ahead of what their competitors can do thanks to 3D printing. And that's just one aspect of where we're seeing Industry 4.0. Here are a few other examples of how companies are using technologies to learn more and innovate. One of the greatest examples of Industry 4.0 is using technologies for what we call predictive maintenance. Knowing when something is about to fail, and then that object automatically asking an engineer to come out and also ordering parts for it. And when the engineer turns up, it's told exactly what he or she has to do. And one of the ways this works is through digital twins. So a lot of work is going on critical components at the moment, such as aircraft engines, where a virtual example of that aircraft engine exists, and sensors on the engine is monitored through this virtual example. And so systems know if they're about to fail, and something can be done about it before it turns out to be very complex. In other scenarios, we're seeing innovation helping companies be much more specific with marketing. If we look at Coca-Cola, one of the world's most famous brands, they famously said that about all the money they spend on marketing, about half of it, they don't know if it's adding any value. They know one half is, but they don't know which half is adding value. So they don't know what to cut back on and necessarily what to focus on. Well, for some time now, Coca-Cola have been using a very simple tracking technology known as RFID. And in this, they're using this to track some of the refill packs going into what they call one of their freestyle machines. So the Coca-Cola freestyle machine at the moment is in the US, and this is a machine where you can go up to, and it's got all their flavors available, so the consumer can choose any type of flavor they would like. The benefit of using sensors with this is that they now know in real time or near real time for each machine what people are ordering. So they know, for example, in the US, in Boston, what is the favorite sort of drinks flavors there at a certain time of day versus what it is in a town outside Atlanta. And it's this level of insight which now helps them much better focus their marketing. And of course, it's also a fourth dimensional thing in terms of time, because they know what people prefer to drink on a weekend versus a Tuesday morning. And so for the first time, they really have unprecedented level of marketing insight, just thanks to the help of a few sensors going into these machines, and allows them to really understand what people in different demographics actually prefer, and therefore target their marketing much more accurately to those different things. Another way we're seeing innovation happening is through large companies who are trying to do a lot of work around consumer electronics. So it doesn't matter if you're big or small, you have to innovate. If we look at the consumer electronics world, devices such as smartphones, in the last year alone, companies in Korea and China have invested over $10 billion working on flexible displays. And what's driving them is that for many years, companies in Japan and Korea had very nice profit margins making LCD displays, so regular displays on glass, which are used by all these different devices around us. But the problem they had is that over a period of time, there began to be more and more suppliers. And so these suppliers began undercutting them, being cheaper. And so suddenly they found that they were losing a lot of their profit margin. And if we look at some of the larger companies in Japan, big brands that you're aware of, companies like Sharp and Sony and others, in about 2 or 3 years, they lost all their profits they had made in the preceding 12 years due to this very stiff competition. So that's why huge sums of money are being invested in new technologies to differentiate. And it is very high risk. It's a lot of money going in, and it may or may not pan out. But if they fail to do it, and if they don't take that risk, then they certainly will also go the way of losing significant sums of money, which is one of the reasons why we're seeing big investment, just having some differentiation, in this case, flexibility. The same is also happening in many different areas, including, for example, sensors. So here in the sensing world, there's a lot of work going on to miniaturize sensors. For example, if you look at your cell phone today, one of the key types of sensing components it doesn't have in it is a gas sensor. This could be used to tell you what pollution is like. Information could be relayed to governments, but also it could be used for things like, is your food still okay to eat right now or not? And so here companies are trying to make things smaller to allow them to put more into your existing phone, or develop completely new form factors, sensors which could be flexible arrays. So these could be applied over things, for example, to monitor temperature in 3D as opposed to discrete temperature sensors. I think one of the surprising things we've also found when companies get into new technologies and look to innovate in these areas is that quite often the market you think you'll be going for isn't always the one where you end up. There's a lot of work improving batteries, for example, because it's a big need. We all want batteries which last a lot longer. And at the moment, traditional battery technologies are only improving by a few % every year. So there's a lot of academic work, a lot of company work going on to try and improve batteries, not by 5% per year, but by a factor of 5. But if we look at the markets where these are being used, it turns out that apparently niche markets can be huge markets. So the battery demand for electric buses is more than the whole battery demand for consumer electronics as of this year, and also that going forward. So I think it's always important when you innovate to really understand and look at all the sectors outside what people commonly talk about. Quite often people tend to follow the glamour. They go for what everyone else is looking at. But we find that the most successful companies tend to be the ones that have identified, niche markets, but these can be huge niche markets where there's less competition as well. Then there's the automotive sector, and this is really seeing a lot of change at the moment. It used to be that there's a handful of companies in the automotive world, maybe 20 or so, and these companies are incredibly dominant around the world. But they've been complacent, and now they're being overtaken, or at least matched. We have, for the first time, technology companies, software companies coming in and making cars which can be completely automated, requiring no drivers. So not only is this changing, their standpoint of view, where they've been focusing on things like quality of the drive and the emotional experience of the drive, but missing that new technology can get the person from A to B without driving. It also means that the business models are changing. For example, we foresee a peak car scenario in about 2030. So it used to be that, back in the 1920s, people stopped buying horses because cars became available. Well, we think in 2030, the number of cars being made will decrease. And the reason for that is that it doesn't really make sense for everyone to buy cars as they currently do. If you look at most car use, people only use cars for about 5 to 6% of their time on average per person. So for about 94% of the time, a car is on your driveway or parked to work doing absolutely nothing. What would be much more efficient is to have cars which just are constantly roaming the streets, automatically, no drivers, and on your app you call it and the nearest car comes to you and takes you wherever you want to go. And then you can completely overcome issues about congestion, pollution, and other aspects. But this can have a huge impact on the automotive industry. Not only are they seeing new competitors from completely unrelated areas such as Google and Apple, but it could be that these companies can leapfrog some of those vehicle companies. So this is a case which is exciting to watch because of all this innovation happening. The other trend we're seeing is, of course, to electric vehicles. And this is now definitely going to happen because governments are pursuing it more and more around the world. And you would think that in the world of electric vehicles going forward, the big winners would be charging stations and utility companies because they're selling the electricity rather than the gasoline. And those companies making batteries. And they will be successful for some period of time. But there's companies already trying to innovate beyond the electric vehicle. And that is to make electric vehicles which are completely what we call energy independent. So they don't have any need to ever be plugged into an electric source or a gas source because they're using some type of energy harvesting technology to take all the energy from the environment to completely power them. We already have a few examples, such as this humble pizza delivery van, which you can see on the right here. This is being used in Italy, and this is currently being sold. But the idea is it drives up to a certain place. You open the flaps, and so the solar panels point upwards. And so it's harvesting sunlight energy the whole time. You can use it to cook pizzas. You sell them at the park or wherever. And at the end of the day, you put the flaps down and you drive home. And it's all completely powered from the solar energy. You never plug this in. You never pay a penny for electricity. You're just using the energy power from the sun. And this is moving to market more quickly than you think, with Chinese company Hanergy last year announcing that thanks to new innovations in light weighting of solar technology, they're now looking to create a vehicle, shown on the left here, which is covered in solar. In this case, the solar is not glass-based, it's lighter weight, so for the first time it's feasible to have cars which can be partly powered by solar energy. Other innovations we're seeing in energy generation include wind energy. This is an area we've been looking at recently where more and more companies are getting involved. These include small companies to giants such as Google. And here the concept is to use wind power to create energy continuously. Quite often in this scenario, they're putting, for example, some type of aerofoil or kite at a certain height into the atmosphere, and it stays there, but it's constantly being pulled by the wind, and so that's generating energy. And so this can be used where you can't use solar. It can be used at nighttime and constantly supply energy, and quite large amounts of energy, to people needing it. And this is already being trialed in places around the world where they don't have easy access to grid energy. And finishing off on the different technology aspects, I also want to look at new manufacturing innovations. So I've already spoken about 3D printing. Here we're having now the combination of 3D printing of plastics with 3D printing of functional parts. The benefit of this is that every single one can be made different. So right now, those in electronics tend to make them all the same because it's so expensive to do that. It's a batch process. But if you can use printing, you can customize every single circuit. So we're seeing the ability to have highly customized products for your customers. And yes, it takes longer to make this way, but the level of customization means that you can offer some new service or benefit that the existing competition cannot. So I just want to wrap up over the last few slides looking at some of the main challenges that we've seen when companies have commercialized different emerging technologies. So looking at a few different aspects, one of the big issues is that companies, at least from the emerging technology point of view, have been very focused on one type of component or material. And they spend a lot of time and money trying to perfect that, but quite often they forget about the complete solution. And at the end of the day, customers want to buy a complete solution. They don't necessarily want to buy a small part of that complete solution, even though no matter how innovative it is. Examples include companies who for many years have made things like very thin, flexible batteries, and for 10 years they found no application for it. But then Estee Lauder, a cosmetic company, came along and realized that they could use this printed battery and put it into a skin patch, which helps reduce wrinkles. They now sell a pack of 5 of these for an astonishing $80. So they can really premium price this because there's nothing else that can do this. You couldn't do it with a coin cell battery. So an important thing, I think, is always to look at, the whole solution and where your innovation can be a part of that. But also, I think, a very important one is just to keep it simple, stupid. Often we see companies be really ambitious with their technology, which is fine if you've got big money, but usually the more ambitious, the longer it takes to get to market. And the companies that have done very well, still focus on that long-term view, but they find short-term applications with simpler designs and simpler concepts to enable them to get there. The other aspect is that we found hardware technologies take a lot longer to get to market than people think. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of VCs tend to be quite interested in software, because with new disruptive business models like Uber and Airbnb, you can much more quickly grow very large businesses, although hardware is, of course, a critical component of that. And I think one of the big challenges for those who are creating completely new types of concepts and solutions is really identifying the best application for it. Companies get involved believing that there's a key application for an innovation, and they spend a lot of time pursuing that market. They tend to go for the markets which will be the biggest, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can take much longer to get there. Whereas we quite often find that the most successful, i.e. profitable companies with new innovations and technologies tend to be the ones that find a niche, but they really dominate it and own it, and they get to market much more quickly in that sense. So summarizing, of course, innovation is key to differentiate from the competition and fix some of these huge problems humanity faces going forward. Many of the companies who just do Me Too products and catch up with their competition without really innovating, all it means is that it's a race to the bottom of the cost curve. So you become a commodity product, and that's okay. But if you can really do something new and identify that someone has value associated with that, it gives you the ability to premium price that product. The other aspect is, really trying to understand where is the money, focusing on the true applications. And therefore, it was very important early on for people who have some innovation at the beginning, say, of the supply chain, to bring in vertical industry knowledge so they can really understand what are the problems different industries face and therefore make the appropriate solution for them. And also, I think the opportunity is there to leapfrog the competition in the same way that companies like Airbnb and Tesla have done. Tesla, just a few weeks ago, were given a market value worth more than Ford, even though they only sell about 1% the number of cars that Ford sell. So there are abilities and ways to leapfrog the competition without huge investment, thanks to these new business models coming through. So my takeaway point for you is, what is the Uber and Airbnb of your sector? Something for you to think about.